May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Please be seated. Welcome to the last Sunday of Pentecost, Christ the King Sunday, and welcome to Judgment Day. A day on which our gospel reading today tells us Christ as King will judge everyone. So how many here have heard of Judgment Day? Ooh, mostly as I thought. One probably can't be a Christian for very long without hearing about Judgment Day. One doesn't have to be a Christian, of course. Judgment Day figures in all three Abrahamic faiths. Maybe one doesn't even need to be a person of faith to have heard of it because it's made its way into popular culture. Movies, for instance. There's Judgment Day from 1981. One synopsis of it reads, "An unusual story that is set in a celestial courtroom where a deceased person is evaluated for entrance into either heaven or hell. Seated before the judge, the in limbo soul is placed on trial, and Mr. Heavener, representing heaven, and Mr. Heller, representing hell, present the good and bad aspects of that person's life, seen in flashbacks. The judge views these aspects to determine whether the forces of good or evil should acquire the soul." There's Defending Your Life from 1991, in which a man finds himself on trial in the afterlife. Legal proceedings will examine his life to determine whether he'll be able to move on to the next or higher stage of existence, or be condemned to be reincarnated and have to deal with the same fears and anxieties he had in his previous life with no new wisdom. That's a blend of Christian and quite a few other thoughts. Perhaps there are more movies with plots that center around the rapture. As a reminder, the rapture is a concept of the end times, in which those who take this position expect God will resurrect all dead Christian believers, who will then be joined with Christians who are still alive at the time. Together they'll rise in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. There are different beliefs as to whether Christ's second coming will occur at the same time or happen much later. Honestly, that little difference equates to a plot twist for movies. Most rapture-style films double as secular doomsday scenarios. Asteroids headed for the Earth, virus spreaders or typhoid Marys, global warming or zombies. So really, they avoid the final judgment altogether in favor of exciting, in-between action hero escapades. They can take your mind off the final judgment before the King. But for people of faith, Judgment Day remains a serious business. We've imagined it playing out in a lot of ways. Two of the more thoughtful looks at final judgment can be found in 1930's Outward Bound and its 1944 remake, Between Two Worlds, both based on a successful 1924 stage play. Turner Classic Movies has this to say about Outward Bound by way of brief synopsis. Passengers on a fog-shrouded ship learn that they are lost souls on the way to heaven or hell. In the fuller synopsis, they write, Anne and Henry, a young English couple, facing an impossible love affair, find that they cannot live without each other. They board an ocean liner through a dense fog where they encounter Tom Pryor, a prodigal son, his mother, Mrs. Midget, whose identity the son does not know, Mrs. Cliveden Banks, an affected socialite, a clergyman who is keen about his missionary work, Mr. Lingley, a captain of industry, and the steward, Scrubby. At first, the passengers don't recall their ultimate destinations or how they came to be on board, with the exception of the young lovers. They each gradually come to grips with the fact that the story of their earthly life is done, that there's nothing to be done now, as the steward tells them. The synopsis continues. Arriving at their destination, they are all judged by the examiner. Interestingly, the examiner doesn't ask any of them to explain or justify themselves, though some try. The only new input allowed, it seems, is how each person feels about themselves in the moments of judgment in light of their history. In today's parable of the sheep and the goats, the king doesn't ask anyone to justify himself. He already knows. Like the examiner in Outward Bound, he has a file on each sheep and each goat. The record of their lives has spoken. There are few things in the Gospels stated by Jesus so plainly and bluntly. This is one of them. All people will be gathered before the King, and there is impending judgment between the righteous and the unrighteous. There's a place in the kingdom for the righteous, an unpleasant destination for the unrighteous. And who are the righteous in this telling? Note that the people are not separated along lines of nationality or faith tradition, nor does the difference seem to be based on a correct theology or a purity of religious practices. The ultimate test of righteousness seems to be determined by actions on behalf of the least of us. Those who respond to their needs, even if they don't recognize doing so, are counted among the sheep. In Jesus' simplified description, these are the ones who gave food to someone who was hungry, those who gave a drink to someone who was thirsty, the ones who welcomed a stranger, those who gave clothing to someone with none, the ones who took care of someone sick, those who visited prisoners. And the unrighteous are named as those who did not do for the least. It's not enough that they apparently overlooked the need. To do or to not do. On this distinction hangs the future of us all. Some of the king's description of doing for the least should sound remarkably familiar. All Saints does those things as easily and regularly as its members breathe. Just responding to human beings and their needs without judging them or their circumstances. Direct action to alleviate suffering and loneliness. Donating clothing and collecting gifts and food baskets for Christmas. Coming together to provide emergency relief. Gathering food for the pantries, growing food. Packing backpacks weekly with food to get students through each weekend. Preparing meals for neighbors at Project Echo. Providing shelter, meals, and company for neighbors participating in Safe Nights. Ready at a moment's notice with meals and calls in support of someone who is ill and their family. gathering around anyone who is experiencing loss and grief, reaching out to neighbors in need, near and far, praying constantly. All Saints on its own and in partnership with community organizations. Less familiar is being prepared to seek out the least because they may well not come looking for us. How might we cross paths with the prisoner and interact in a safe and meaningful way? Jesus was a prisoner. St. Paul was a prisoner and wrote of the great blessing of his visitors. It's possible, if challenging, to go into a jail or prison. There is the Kairos prison ministry if you sense that might be your calling. There are also organizations working with people as they transition out of incarceration and try to establish a stable and productive life. People in prison have families who have needs. Help might come in the form of a donation to a Claggett camp for children of incarcerated parents. And let's face it, most of us aren't trained or qualified to directly seek out the homeless in encampments, but we can volunteer with organizations that try to support them. All Saints does that when it partners with Good Shepherd to host Safe Nights for its week each year. Up in Annapolis, Lighthouse Incorporated runs the Safe Harbor Resource Center, where those in transition or who are still unhoused can get a shower, do laundry, pick up a meal and toiletries, and see a professional coordinator about available resources. It's volunteers who keep Safe Harbor open. They welcome clients and offer genuine fellowship. It's a place where one can develop ears to hear and eyes to see the need behind the appearance of homelessness. Lighthouse and Project Echo would welcome more volunteers. So far, I've described action. There's also being action. Sometimes a person's greatest need is for you, just as you are, willing to be with them for a little, in conversation or in silence. My first memorable experience with this came when I was a student again in my 30s. In the middle of a botany lab, I ran off to the ladies' room. There was a young lady huddled on the floor, crying. I asked if she were all right, and she nodded yes. Back to the lab. But it didn't sit well. First moment I got, back to the ladies' room. The young lady was still there, still crying inconsolably. We got to talking, and between popping back to the lab when I thought I was needed and popping back to talk with her, she was able to unburden, get out what was bothering her, and feel that somebody cared enough. Another opportunity came when a new neighbor's daughter brought her mother, Virginia, by to meet me. Virginia was aging and her health was declining. She wasn't able to get around. It became more than just that one-time visit. Virginia loved to just sit and have morning coffee with someone, and the daughter she lived with was a police officer and, as you can imagine, not frequently there. Virginia became a very dear and close friend. Over coffee, reading books, talking theology. It's great when you can go to your neighbor and just sit down and talk about God. So those are mostly familiar, but probably less familiar, maybe even strange, is indirect action. By that, I mean advocacy. I don't mean campaigning. I do mean advocacy on behalf of the least, reminding everyone, including those who represent the people, of the need to look out for the least. Jesus advocated for the poor, the possessed, those considered disabled and sinners when he chastised the Pharisees, scribes, and Sadducees. If you don't believe me, read Matthew chapters 21 and 22. What does it say about societies around the world who deem that the poor are not worth regular medical care that might alleviate their suffering and prevent more serious conditions? What will the king say about the fact they accept as normal that the sick without means will have to go without treatment or are sentenced to a lifetime of debt in order to get it? We are not alone in this conundrum, and I don't know if there is any one really good answer to this. I am convinced that caring for the least demands that we try to address this need in our community. In between two worlds, when it looks as though the devoted young lovers will be eternally separated and there's nothing to change that outcome, Stubby the steward appeals to the examiner. He throws everything he is and has into his argument. He himself has accepted his judgment and has since served faithfully, compliant in all things. He's never questioned his fate or his job, but now he advocates humbly yet fiercely for this couple. Through his advocacy, their destiny is changed. Any one of us can pick the gap they most care about and advocate so that others become aware of the need and have an opportunity to work for solutions. Remember, for the goats, it won't matter that they didn't recognize a need. They're expected to open their eyes and go looking. Advocacy might well save a goat. To do or to not do, it's fundamentally about how one has spent one's life. Does one spend one's life entirely for oneself or in the service of others? Does that sound familiar? It should. Christ the King seeks mercy and justice, compassion and healing, friendship and welcome, good humor and humility. These are all things Jesus demonstrated during his earthly life and called his followers to imitate. Among the flock at the King's right hand are authentic followers of Jesus. They are his sheep. They hear his voice. They follow him in the way of love. They feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the prisoner, heal the sick, and welcome the stranger. We do not do it out of fear of Judgment Day, but for love of Christ. To have the way of love become so much a part of our being that we can't do otherwise than to act, and to act out of love. That our vision is so clear we can spot a person in need as easily as we see the sun. That our heart is so clean we know we must serve that person somehow. That our mind is so focused we simply always act to serve that person. To pour out one's life out of love of others, just as Jesus poured out his for us. May it be that way for us, beloved, so much so that at the last we're amazed when the King calls us to join the flock at his right hand, and we can genuinely ask, Lord, When was it that we saw you in need and served you? And the king will answer, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me. Come, enter into the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Amen.